It's so good. Ooh, I have to stop myself. I'm a picker. It's a bad habit. I like to, if I wasn't thinking and there was like a pecan pie or something, I would seriously just come over and like pick off the top one by one. It's so rude. I really have to stop myself. Hey everyone, I'm Saffitz, and we are back with more episodes of Try This at Home. In the past, we've tackled some big projects like croissants and bagels, and today I'm showing you a slightly simpler recipe, but is no less versatile, and it is classic challah bread. And it's surprisingly simple. It's a great recipe for beginners who are just trying to get into bread making. You don't need a stand mixer, the whole thing is done by hand. And then I'm gonna show you a couple different ways to shape it, and then another application, which is a cinnamon babka. So love making this recipe, so versatile, so good, and so fun to make. I have a lot of memories of eating challah. I mean, I'm Jewish. I grew up in St. Louis going to Reformed Jewish congregation where there was just like challah, for like all occasions. My first memories are eating like store-bought challah, and I did not like it. But I love making it at home, and I've come to really appreciate the qualities of a challah. So challah is an enriched bread dough. So enriched meaning there's eggs and fat added to it. I noticed when I was doing research and looking at a lot of different recipes for challah that a lot of them call for like a really large quantity of yeast, like tablespoons of yeast to make 1 or 2 loaves. And generally speaking, the smaller amount of yeast, the longer the fermentation, the better the quality of the bread, the better the flavor, the better the texture. So I wanted to use kind of sound bread making principles in this challah to achieve not just something like really beautiful and tasty, but to make like a really good quality crumb and have, that tends to like stale slower and just last longer and just overall taste better. So the first step of the recipe is to do something called a preferment. A preferment is a mixture of like a portion of the flour and liquid in the recipe that's mixed with the yeast and is allowed to kind of like activate just at room temperature, and then it's added to the dough. It's really easy. This is called a sponge. So a teaspoon of yeast. Use a large bowl because this is the bowl that you're going to mix the rest of the dough in. Then I have some warm tap water here, and I'm gonna add just a 1/4 cup. There's like a dehydrated coating around the yeast and active dry yeast. It's to dissolve that and to get that yeast like woken up and ready to raise the bread. So go ahead and whisk that together until the yeast is dissolved. Now a 1/2 cup of room temp tap water. And this will cool it down a little bit because we want a nice slow fermentation. Then I'm gonna add 1 1/4 cups flour, so about 170 grams, and this is a portion of the flour in the final recipe. So this goes in. Once you've added the flour, go ahead, you can use a flexible spatula like this or a bowl scraper, and just stir until all the flour is hydrated, and you'll have this kind of like thick looking batter kind of mixture. So just, you wanna make sure there's no floury spots, and I like to make sure the sides of the bowl are scraped down really, really well. But you don't need to mix beyond just like combining everything well. Okay, so this is ready to go. And now I'm going to cover this and let it sit. Instead of using plastic wrap, you can just cover it with like a dinner plate like this. And we're gonna let this sit at room temperature until you'll notice like a dramatic transformation. It will loosen up, it will expand in volume a couple times, even triple in volume, and the surface will be super bubbly and even a little bit domed. So it's gonna look like it's on the verge of collapse. And that's when it's ready to mix the dough. So this is the sponge that we mixed a few hours ago. It actually went like a little bit long. The way that I know that it's like a little bit past its prime is because it's cratered a little bit. So it was super domed and bubbly, and there's like a little bit of a high water mark around the edge. But that's okay if it goes a little bit past. It's happened to me many times. It's not that big of a deal. But we do want to mix the dough as quickly as possible. All of the water that is in the dough is already in the sponge. So the only other liquid ingredients I have are eggs and then my sweetener and the fat. So again, I'm using olive oil and honey. I just love the flavors in challah. I have 1/3 cup of olive oil, then honey. Okay, so then I'm gonna add 2 whole eggs and 1 yolk. This gets whisked together, mostly just to break up the eggs. Then I'm gonna add this to my bowl with our preferment. Again, everything just gets mixed here in this one bowl. Oh, I should say, I'm using bread flour here. That's an important part of the recipe. So bread flour is a high protein flour and that higher protein corresponds to the amount of gluten that you can develop in the dough. And it's that gluten that's really important to the structure of the challah, the texture of the crumb, all of that. So I have 3 additional cups of bread flour. Again, I recommend weighing everything. Then a tablespoon of salt. So I'm using Diamond Crystal Kosher salt. It seems like a lot of salt, but it's a lot of dough. It makes a really big loaf, and you really do need all of that salt to bring out the flavor of everything. It's also important to the texture. So now I'm gonna you can use a flexible spatula, but I'm gonna use a bowl scraper. Make sure you're scraping along the bottom of the bowl because you wanna incorporate that pre-ferment. And you can see it has this kind of crazy stringy texture. See that? So we wanna mix everything together. And then make sure you have a clean work surface because we are gonna knead this by hand, just right on the countertop. If you wanted to use your stand mixer, you certainly could. You should mix your pre-ferment in the bowl of the stand mixer and then follow all these instructions. And then I would actually still mix this part by hand because the dough hook doesn't really easily get against the sides of the bowl. So go ahead and mix everything like this by hand, then pop it into the stand mixer with the dough hook. Okay, this has mostly come together. It's like a shaggy dough at the moment. I have some little dry bits. This makes a pretty sticky dough at first, so I'm gonna really generously flour my work surface with some bench flour, and then this whole mixture gets scraped out onto that surface. Then a little more flour over top. And this is that stage where handling the dough and feeling it is really important because we are going to knead this together. We're gonna work it for a good 10 to 15 minutes until it's super smooth and supple, and I'll show you a test for when you know you're done with the kneading process. So kneading is a process of working the dough and developing all of that gluten, and it's a motion that is like folding and kind of pushing away. I like to work with my left, this sort of fleshy part of my left palm, with my right hand on top for extra push, and then really kind of pressing the dough and sliding it across the surface. Then I give it a little rotation and a fold, and it's that same kind of pushing away. So I can tell at this stage that this dough, it's not feeling particularly sticky, so I might not need to add any additional flour. But as you work it and that flour is hydrated, it might become a little bit sticky. So if it starts to stick to your hand or the surface, just add a little extra flour. And you're gonna keep adding flour as you go. If at any point it gets a little bit sticky. If it comes off on your hand, if it sticks to your hand, it's sticky. But if it clings to your hand and then releases, that's tacky. Okay, so it's picked up most of those dry bits. And if you have little dry areas, you can run the dough over them to pick them up. It's still pretty streaky and mottled looking. And so we wanna just knead this until it becomes really smooth, really supple, nice and elastic also. And this is a good 10 or 15 minutes of kneading by hand. So as I said, the recipe is designed to be flexible depending on what kind of flour you're using, because flours absorb moisture differently. So if you feel like you're adding a lot of flour, don't be alarmed. It's normal to have to add up to even an additional half cup of flour as you knead. Both as you knead and as you knead. Both types of knead. I've been kneading this for probably between 10 and 15 minutes. So now I'm going to show you a test to determine if you're done with kneading and you're ready to move on to bulk fermentation. So you're going to pinch off a piece of dough. You just pinch it off with your fingers like this. So it's a golf ball sized piece of dough, more or less. And you're going to take your fingertips and just flatten it out. And then you're going to gently pull it apart in all directions and flatten it out further. And the idea is what we're doing here is we're checking for sufficient gluten development. So this is something called a windowpane test. And you don't want to pull it too quickly. You have to do it sort of slowly. But what we want to achieve here is a almost film-like piece of dough that is so thin that light can pass through it. And that is how you know that there is sufficient elasticity in the dough and enough gluten development that you can proceed. So here you can really see. It's good to hold it up to a light source to double check. Yeah. So this is our windowpane. Again, if it tears before you get to this point, go ahead and continue kneading. And then just, if you're there, stick it back on the dough. If you are making a raisin-studded challah, which is the traditional challah that's eaten at Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, you're gonna wanna soak your raisins. So I have a half cup of golden raisins. And I just poured some hot water over them to hydrate them and plump them. Dried fruit, particularly dried grapes or raisins, has like a very high concentration of sugar, and it's so high that will actually pull moisture from the dough and will dry out the dough if you don't soak it first. So that's the purpose of soaking. So these have been soaking, they're nice and soft and plump. I'm gonna drain them. So I drained it, and now I'm gonna pat the raisins dry, because otherwise if they're really wet, it's gonna be hard to incorporate them into the dough. And now I'm gonna show you how to incorporate them. To knead them in, what you wanna do is flatten out the dough. So just kind of press it with the heel of your hand. It doesn't have to be any particular shape at all. You just wanna flatten it and create a lot of surface area. Now I just kneaded this dough, so it's like a little bit springy. If you're getting lots of spring back, you can let it rest for like 5 minutes. You can also use like the friction between the dough and the surface to help it flatten out a little bit. So once you have it flattened out to like just under an inch thick, you are then gonna scatter the raisins over the surface and then gather everything up into a ball, and then we're gonna knead it until all the raisins are evenly distributed throughout. So you can just kind of like, you can roll it up or just kind of fold it up like this. And this is just an easier way to do it. It means that like all the raisins are enclosed and you're not dealing with like, you know, like raisins all over the surface and trying to pick them up and getting them into the center of the dough. I can feel them like inside. I don't love raisins. I would not opt for this challah, but I think it's a great option because it is so traditional. But this is what I like about the recipe, is you can use the dough in so many ways, and this is just one application. But so this is ready to go. And we have several other doughs that we set up ahead of time to show you all the variations. So this is just that one round variation for Rosh Hashanah, and then we have our 6-strand and our cinnamon babka. So I'm really excited to get into that forming process, but first we have to let this rise. So as I said, this goes into a bowl. You can dust it with a little bit of flour first, and then into a clean bowl. We're gonna let this sit at warm room temperature. Again, something in a warm spot that's like in that 80-degree range is really good for proofing. It's gonna become super pillowy and soft, and when you poke it, it will spring back but leave a little indentation. And that will take, 1 to 2 hours, possibly even longer depending on temperature. We have our challah dough that has risen. So I want to show you what it looks like. I would say doubled, maybe even slightly more than doubled in size. And I wish you could feel what it feels like, because it is just like so pillowy underneath. When I press down, you can see that it springs back, and that's an indication that there's lots of gas in there, but then it holds an indentation. So this looks great, it feels great. Really excited to braid it into a 6-strand braid. The first time I tried a 6-strand braid, I was trying to read it from like a recipe, and I was just like, my brain I could not follow it. And it's a little bit tricky. Like if you lose your process during it, it's a little hard to get back on track and to like see where you are. But I'm gonna walk you through all the steps. It really does, to me, make the most beautiful braided challah though, the 6-strand braid. So I'm gonna turn the dough out. Now I can't tell you exactly the weight that each piece will be, because it depends on like how much flour you added and your dough in particular, but it will be somewhere between 180 and 190 grams per piece. So I like to, oh, it feels so good. It's like really, really fun to feel and handle. It's just a really satisfying textural recipe. I'm gonna go with 190 per piece and see where that gets me. 190. Oh, okay, I'm really gonna be more like 180. I mean, you don't have to be this crazy about it. You can, if there are a couple grams off, it's like no big deal at all. I like to kind of like bundle everything up and tuck them in. This tends to give you a really nice, smooth strand. Now, another thing you can do is if you feel like lots of big air bubbles in there, go ahead and pop them and squeeze them, because any big pockets of air is just gonna make it difficult to roll out. You shouldn't really need a lot of flour or even any flour at all. Again, it's that friction between the surface and the dough that's going to help you lengthen it and stretch it out to the size that you want. So I'm just going to apply like even pressure along the length of my hands back and forth from the center outward. And I also like to taper the pieces a little bit at the ends, and that gives you this really nice evenly shaped braid. Now, if you need additional friction, like maybe your dough is stiff or you had a little extra flour and you're not able to get that friction with the surface, you can just put like a couple drops of water on your surface and smear that around, and that will help you. Like I'm not actually getting that much friction, so I might use a tiny bit of water. I literally just wet my hand. All right, that actually helped a lot. Okay, so let's see the length on this guy. All right, that's about 18 inches. So now I'm going to just roll out all of my portions of dough to the same length. And then once you have one measure, just use it as your benchmark for the rest. So all of my strands have been now like elongated and lengthened into these ropes. Now I'm ready to start braiding. I'm gonna do one quick step though. I have some bench flour right here. I'm gonna dust the strands really lightly in flour just to coat them. So if you like mess up and you have to go back and unbraid, then you won't have like lots of sticking. It also helps to preserve some definition in between the strands as it bakes. So I like this little step. Dust them a little bit, and then I like to kind of like give them a roll through the flour. I'm gonna now orient the strands vertically. So I'm going to line them all up next to each other. Okay, so now to start your braid, you are going to pinch everything together at the very top. So just bring all the ends together and pinch. And now, here's where you want to pay extra close attention. When I was teaching myself how to do this, I looked at YouTube videos. Because you really have to see it done. It's so hard to follow when it's being described in words. So have your laptop next to you while you're doing this. Have a clean finger for like hitting, like the space bar to start and stop the video, and just follow along with me. I'll go slow. So the first step is going to be to cross the outer right strand, so that's on the far left. Like you don't want to apply too much tension at this point. So just kind of loosely bring that over. And then you're going to take what was originally the far left strand, and which is now second from the left, so this one right here, and you're going to cross it all the way over to the far right. So you have this little twist here at the top, okay? So then take your other strands and separate them a bit with a space in the middle. So you have a group of 2 here and a group of 2 here. Okay, so you're going to take that very first strand we moved that was over here and that is now up here, the one that is on top. So you see how this one is crossed on the bottom and this one's crossed on the top. You're going to take the one on top and you're going to move it down toward the center, but you are going to group it with the ones on the right. So the one on the top, if you're moving from the left, is going to come down and be grouped with your 2 strands here on the right. This folds down like so. So now I have a group of 3 strands right here. I'm going to take the second strand from the right, or the kind of outermost strand from the group of 3, and now cross it all the way over to the far left. So now again, I have my 2 strands out to the sides, then I have my 4 strands here in the middle with 2 on the left and 2 on the right. Then I'm going to take the strand on the top right, which is now the one on top, so I have my horizontal strands here, the one on top, bring it down to the middle, and I'm moving from the right, so I'm going to group it with the 2 strands on the left. Just bear with me, okay? So you're going to take the one of the 2 sort of horizontal strands, the one on top, and bring it down to the middle, grouping it with the strands on the opposite side. So moving from the right to grouping with the strands on the left. Now I have a grouping of 3 strands on this side. I'm going to take the outermost strand, or the second from the left, and cross this one over here. So it is just a matter of repeating that motion, taking the sort of the strands that are on the sides, taking the one on top, moving it to the center and grouping it with the strands on the opposite side. So now, this is how you know if you're getting lost in the process, take a look at your setup. I can see here that I have 3 strands on this side, so I know I have to move the outer strand to the opposite side. And now taking the strand that's on top, moving it from far right to like center left. Now I have 3 strands over here. I'm going to take the outer strand of the grouping of 3, move it to the far right, and just continue that process. Does this make sense?
Yeah. No, totally.
Okay. It's a pattern. Already. Yeah. Okay. Now, once you get to that, once you've done it a couple times and you get into this, where you get the feel of it, start to apply a little bit of tension. So you want to create a little bit of tension in the braid, and that's going to help you get a really nice rise out of your dough. So that just means giving it a nice little tug as you work. So you see I'm ever so gently tugging on it as I move it over. And you can see that it makes this incredibly beautiful pattern with a sort of center tall braid and then like a lower braid underneath. It's so pretty. So, okay, so I'm kind of at the point where it's like I can't really figure out my next step anymore. So this is where I just kind of, I'm like, oh, well, bye-bye, you know, tablespoon of dough or whatever. So that's perfectly fine. Okay, so now I have this beautiful, like long, kind of skinnier braid. And now I'm just gonna transfer it to my lined baking sheet. If you can use like a bench scraper or a bowl scraper to help you, or you can just kind of lift it up. So kind of rock it over. This looks so pretty. I'm so excited about it. And now we are going to let this proof. But before I let it rise, I'm actually gonna do a quick layer of egg wash. You know, what I love about challah is that incredibly burnished, shiny exterior. And the best way to achieve that is to do 2 layers of egg wash. I'm just gonna do a thin layer across like every little bump of dough. You don't want like lots of pooling egg on that baking sheet. So just, you know, a thin but thorough layer. Okay, so spoiler, here is the baked challah, and here is my unproofed braid. So this is really important because I want you to see the size difference. I one time spoke to a baker who told me that the point of bread making is to take the smallest amount of ingredients and make them as big as possible. This is what I want to illustrate here is like how important the proofing process is you want to get from here to here. Like the first couple times I made this, I underproofed it because I was going for that like just normal doubled in size kind of look, and it really needs to go longer. The egg wash here is like a little bit sticky, and so I'm gonna oil the plastic wrap. That's an important step. So you want to cover it loosely with plastic. So I kind of just like drape it, let it fall on there as loosely as I can. So now that we saw the 6-strand braid, I'm gonna show you the technique for forming the round, which is way, way easier. So I'm gonna uncover this. This is the dough that we mixed this morning. And you can see same texture, like just so, that's one of the, don't be alarmed, it's not bruised. This is just like a smeared raisin. Don't look at that. Same texture, just like so pillowy, so airy. It's really so much fun to like touch. Now I don't need the scale for this because the forming is so much simpler and evenness is much less important. So I'm just gonna divide the dough in half. And this is, I really can just eyeball it. It's much less important that these are the same weight. Okay, and now I'm gonna take each piece and roll each one into a long snake that's about 28 inches long. I like to pinch, not only to start to lengthen it and form this shape, but to squeeze out any big air pockets, because that just makes it harder. So same basic like proportions of the snakes. So, you know, mostly even, but slightly tapered at the ends. That makes the forming a little bit easier. And you can see that like, even if maybe you hadn't like kneaded your raisins throughout really thoroughly, but this technique, like this forming shape, they'll be really evenly distributed, even if you didn't knead them in so thoroughly. So I'm going to take my 2 strands, I'm going to cross one over the other. So right in the center, making an X. Okay, so then you're going to go on one side and you're going to twist the strands. And again, this is going to help you create tension in the dough. And it's that tension that's going to form like a really nice, even, tall loaf. Okay, so, and then go ahead and twist the other side as well. Okay, and then you're just going to start at one end of your twist, and you are going to start to fold it in on itself and coil the dough. And then once you get to the end, just kind of bring that around. And now you have this like beautiful, tall, it looks I think like more ornate than it really is to form on there, but really a quick way to form a round. And then same thing, some oiled plastic wrap, and we're gonna look for the same indicators of doneness before we bake. Okay, this is a fully proofed braided challah dough. So I'm gonna show you the indicators of a fully proofed loaf. And I do think that underproofing is one of sort of the potential pitfalls of this recipe. It is easy to kind of like jump the gun a little bit and put it in the oven prematurely. So you wanna really make sure that you see that size expansion. This is, like to me, easily doubled in size. And visually, like I can almost see the little air bubbles underneath, and it's super, super light. And when I press onto the dough, it springs back pretty quickly, but leaves an indentation. So this looks great. I'm gonna give it a final layer of egg wash. And I have my oven on 350. Be careful when you're applying the egg wash because there's so much air in there that you don't wanna like poke the dough or deflate anything or puncture it anywhere. Also keep in mind that you could refrigerate the dough, I forgot to mention this, after the shaping, but you could refrigerate the unproofed loaf also with the egg wash and the oily piece of plastic, and then pull it out of the fridge the next day and let it proof on the countertop. And because it's starting cold, it's gonna take a little bit longer, but a good option if you wanna kind of divide up the timing and the work. Okay, so it's gonna go into the oven. This will bake for 30 to 35, and I'm looking for like super deep golden brown color. It will sound hollow on the bottom when tapped, and I can also take the internal temperature if I'm not sure. So if it's a really well-proofed dough, you shouldn't really need to take the temperature. The color indicator should be enough, but if you're unsure, you can always stick a thermometer in the center and look for like 190 to 200 to register. So 30 to 35 minutes. Oh, sorry, one thing. If you want to add sesame seeds or poppy seeds, this is the time to do it. Do it after that second layer of egg wash. They'll stick really well. I like to be super generous with it, but I'm gonna leave this one plain so we can just appreciate the raw beauty of the braid. This is my raisin challah. It has been proofing for maybe like an hour and a half. That looks great. One fantastic application of our challah dough is babka. And this is a cinnamon babka, and I kept it dairy-free because we know that the dough is dairy-free. So why add it, when we're doing the filling, keep it parve. Plus, I'm kind of doubling down on like the olive oil flavor. And this is such a wonderful and like slightly unexpected version of cinnamon babka. So the dough, we make a full recipe of dough, divide it in half, and you make 2 babkas, so you'll need 2 loaf pans. I have a piece of parchment paper. I cut the width of the parchment paper to fit the length of the loaf pan like that. And I have a little additional olive oil here for brushing. Okay, so I have just a thin layer of oil. The parchment just gets pressed down into the bottom and up the sides. And smooth it really well, try to eliminate any air bubbles if you can. And then I have a little bit of excess, and that excess is useful for lifting the babka out of the pan, just to prevent like the edges of the parchment from folding over and sticking to the surface of the babka. I like to just give them a little fold. So as the babka bakes, some of that like brown sugary filling seeps into the bottom, and it mixes with the oil, and it makes this like olive oily caramel. It's so, so yummy. Don't get me wrong, I love butter flavor. Butter flavor is great, but it's such a satisfying kind of spin on like, a buttery babka, that kind of thing. Okay, so you can set that aside. Then I'm gonna mix my filling. So as I said, I have almond flour and brown sugar, and then salt, then a tablespoon of ground cinnamon. Then I'm also gonna grate into this bowl a teaspoon of finely grated orange zest. I love the combination of like brown sugar and orange zest. And orange can be overwhelming really, really easily, but just a little bit of zest kind of perfumes everything, and it's a kind of flavor where when you taste it, you're like, what is that? Like what's that sort of extra little layer of flavor? It's really good. So then just mix this together really, really well. Crush any little lumps of brown sugar or almond flour if you come across them. I'm gonna set aside a 1/4 cup of this mixture, and this is going to be what I sprinkle on top. So when I was developing the recipe, I kept going back and forth of like, should I top it with a glaze? Should I top it with a streusel? And I just settled on sprinkling some of the filling on top because it gives me like that texture that I want and a little extra sweetness, and I don't have to add an additional step. So the first step of the recipe is to have your challah dough ready to go. When you poke it, you can see that the dough springs back, which is an indication that there's lots of air in there, but it leaves an indentation. So this looks great. I'm gonna turn it out and divide it in half. So I'm just gonna eyeball half. And then while you're rolling out one half, because you don't want the other half of the dough to continue to ferment and rise, you're gonna put this on like a small rim baking sheet or on a dinner plate, cover it, and stick it in the fridge. So now I'm gonna roll this out. I'm gonna dust a little bit of flour on my work surface. So go ahead, you're gonna knock all the gas out because you're gonna roll it, but I like to sort of press it into the shape that I want with my fingers first. And I'm gonna roll this out into a very long rectangle, about 24 inches long and 8 inches wide. Go ahead and roll this out. And I have a little bit of flour, but I'm not gonna use too much because a little bit of friction between the work surface and the dough is really useful. That helps to extend the dough. Because I want this to be pretty thin. And I want it to be thin because I want like a nice dramatic spiral inside the babka. Okay, so I think I'm almost at 8. If it's springing back really stubbornly, because we are rolling it out really thin, just cover it on the work surface and let it rest for 5 or 10 minutes, cover it with like a damp towel. So for forming the babka, I have a 1/4 cup of olive oil, 4 tablespoons, but that's for 2 babka. So I'm gonna drizzle just 2 tablespoons or half that amount across the surface. And this is what really creates that caramelized layer on the bottom. It's that mingling between the olive oil and the brown sugar. And go ahead and brush this across the surface of the dough. And leave a little bit of a border on the longer side that's facing away from you. So not this side, but the far side. But you can go all the way to every other edge. Then I'm gonna sprinkle half of the filling. You're just going to cover the entire surface, but again, avoiding that little clean border on the further long side. So once you do that, now I'm gonna go ahead and pat the filling into the surface and spread it around so I have an even layer everywhere. Okay, it's really even, and now I'm gonna roll it up. So I'm gonna start at the end closest to me and roll away. So it's helpful to start with just a little, working from one side to the other, like left to right or right to left, just to kind of start that spiraled effect. And one thing I also like to do is to give it a little bit of a tug as I'm going to help stretch out the dough, kind of stretch it toward you and then roll. And that will help to create a more defined spiral. So now it's all rolled up into this kind of tight spiraled log. And then once you have it rolled up, it's resting on that seam where I had that clean border of dough. And I like to give it a little pinch just to seal the dough right there. And this is also an opportunity to even out the thickness a little bit. Okay, now I'm ready to form the twist. So the babka has this kind of double spiral when you cut it open because I twist together this log. So I'm just gonna trim off the ends, just where it's the thickness is irregular. And I wanna basically trim off anywhere that I don't have full coverage of the filling. And then I'm gonna cut it in half crosswise. You can see it's starting to shrink back a little bit. So then you're gonna take your pieces of dough, you're gonna cross one over the other in the center, like an X. And now I'm gonna twist them. So twisting from one side, I'm gonna twist like this. And then I'm gonna go onto the other side and twist the rest of the way. So now I have this beautiful twist, and then this is gonna go into your prepared loaf pan. And now the final step before I let these proof is to press down and flatten that twist a little bit, just so it fills out some of the bottom. So this is our babka. It is ready for its second rise, that's the proof stage. So I'm gonna cover it and let it sit again in a warm room temperature spot. I'm gonna show you the indicators of doneness when it's proofed. Then I'll show you how to finish it with that little bit of extra topping and bake it. And in the meantime, I'm gonna form the second one, just like I did the first, with the remaining filling and olive oil. Okay, the babka are proofed. I would say they're doubled in size. They've mostly filled out through the bottom of the pan, and that's a good indicator of doneness. And that's partly why I press them down and flattened a little bit, so that just helps you to determine how much they've grown. And there again, you have that spring back, and I know I've repeated this many times, but the spring back is an indication that there is sufficient gas built up in the dough. So when you put it in the oven, it's gonna get super light. And I have an oven preheated to 350, and these can bake side by side, so you don't have to bake them one at a time. So about 2 tablespoons of the reserved filling on top. I did watch the Seinfeld, not on purpose, but it was just, I've been watching a lot of Seinfeld, and I did watch the Babka episode, which is also the black and white cookie episode. Great episode. Elaine's it's the lesser babka, no one likes the cinnamon babka. Not true. Not true at all. Okay, these, they look great. I'm gonna put them in the oven, and these are gonna go for 40 to 45 minutes, and I like to rotate them to make sure they're baking evenly. So in they go. All right, I am so excited to cut into the challah and try them, especially the babka. It smells so good. So make sure that the breads have fully cooled. You don't want to cut into bread while it's hot because you end up like allowing all of the steam to escape and it dries out the crumb. So try to be patient. And I'm gonna demonstrate what the bread sounds like. If you can hear that. Sounds like kind of hollow. And so that's how you know that you proofed it and baked it really well. Now traditionally challah is torn, but I'm gonna cut into it because I want you to see like a profile of the interior and what the crumb looks like. Okay, so this is what the crumb looks like. It is super even. It has a nice like golden color from the honey and the olive oil. It's nice, there's a silkiness to it. That's kind of like the way that I like to describe the texture. So I'm gonna actually just cut a slice and pull it apart and show you what that looks like. It smells, it's like really yeasty. I get some of that olive oil, and I love the way the texture just kind of like, you can like pull out, it's like string cheese. You can like pull off strands of it, little threads. That to me is like the classic challah texture. I love eating it this way, like little threads. Okay, that is the plain classic challah. I'm now gonna cut into the babka so I can show that to you. I love how these turned out. Like I love the proportions, the shape is so pleasing. It's like this really cute little kind of squat loaf. I love the texture of the crumble on top, and I'm really excited to cut in and show you the spiral. Do wait for it to be fully cooled before you slice into it. And use a bread knife. I'm gonna show you what that looks like. Can you see the steam because it's hot? Yeah. Look, it's after 5. We all gotta go home. So I did cut into it hot, but try to let it cool. Look at the spiral. It looks so good. Like I love the definition, and it's that almond flour that gives you a really defined spiral, but it's not, we didn't have to add so much sugar to get there. So this is like a really lightly sweet babka that makes the best toast. It's so good. Wow. I love this application for challah. You don't typically see challah or like a style of dough like challah as the basis of babka, but it's really perfect because it's rich, it's light, and this is a dairy-free version where you taste it and you would not know that it's dairy-free at all. It's so rich and delicious. And the smell is like insane. Okay, I'm gonna taste it. That like silky quality of the crumb is really enhanced by that ribbon. I love the little bit of texture from the almond flour. This to me is like the best cinnamon toast, but wrapped up in one package. It's just so, so delicious. I mean, this is really a recipe that you could make truly anytime for any occasion. You don't even really need a reason, but of course with the Jewish New Year coming up, do give the raisin-studded round a try. And then once you get comfortable with the dough, it's something you can make like all the time, once a week if you want to. And I really can't think of like a better recipe to kind of dip your toes in the baking pool than classic challah. Such a fun recipe to put together, requires no equipment basically, and a great way to like practice your 6-strand braid. So thank you so much for watching, and I'm very excited to bring you more episodes of Try This at Home.